Hello and welcome to Behind the Headlines. This recording is for Wednesday, the 11th of August, and this is a pre-recorded program as our studios are closed in London for 3 weeks. So we're having to record a series of programs to make sure that you have new content for August while we're away. So in tonight's program, we will be discussing the collapse of the Soviet Union that occurred 30 years ago this week. And we'll be asking what significance was the collapse of the Soviet Union, not only in terms of its geostrategic importance, but also its prophetic importance and what led to the breakup of the mighty and powerful Soviet Union that merged onto effectively the world scene in 1924 with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And we saw Stalin take power in 1924. And then after the Second World War, it was the Soviet Union, together with the United States, that remained the world's two superpowers. And of course, that period of history is known as the Cold War. Regan, it's great to be recording a program with you, particularly on this topic, as this week literally marks the 30th anniversary of the final collapse of the Soviet Union, that once mighty, powerful superpower that no one actually envisioned would actually collapse and fall in the incredibly dramatic style and fashion that it did.
Oh, it's an incredible historical event, and you can see the trajectory that was over many years that eventually led to its final fall, really in 1991. There are some iconic moments. You can think of even sporting rivalries between the USA and the USSR that really brought the two, capitalist versus communist societies at odds with one another. And so everything was very politicized. You can think of Ronald Reagan's powerful speech at the Berlin Wall, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. You can even think of Rocky IV, where you always had these films that painted guys from the Soviet Union in this particular way, and there's generally a sense in which the USA is a sort of underdog, and the USSR has to be overcome in some way. So there's a lot of stuff that was going on at the time. There were a lot of things in media and everyday life that showed that tension. And if you look at the days after, and if you read some of the records, particularly of Christians who lived under the USSR, you think what a blessed thing it was when the Iron Curtain finally fell.
Oh, absolutely. But what's also important is that as the recording of this program today, which is August the 11th, actually marks the 30th anniversary of the attempted coup that took place in Moscow. It was hardliners that belonged to the government, the communist government in Russia, to go on with hardline military forces that didn't want to see the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so therefore they attempted a coup d'etat against Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then the president of the USSR, which lasted 3 days. There's some reports are saying that the coup organizers were so disorganized that they were drunk, didn't really know what they were doing. And then we saw that Boris Yeltsin came to the fore by condemning this coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, calling for democratic elections and freedom. And that essentially led to him becoming the first president of the Federation of Russia. And then we saw the complete dismantlement of the Soviet Union. But there were key stages before that happened. I mean, if we take, for example, in the early 1980s, 1980, with the Solidarity movement in Poland, where they actually developed their own first trade union outside of the influence of the Soviet Union. And that was considered a big front to the Soviet forces, and that was crushed in 1981, and then we saw it became revived back in 1989. But it seems like 1989 was one of the key years in which we saw that. But we also saw in the 80s, so the words like perestroika and there's another particular name I'm trying to think of as well, that represented, and glasnost, of course, which represents reform. So we saw that Gorbachev was a new Soviet leader that wanted to reform the Soviet Union because they realized they were running out of money. But it was a very, very clever strategy on behalf of Ronald Reagan, your namesake, I think my favorite president, in the fact that he fueled this arms race, a nuclear arms race in the early 80s with the Soviet Union. So that means the Soviet Union had to keep up with the Americans, which led to effectively the Soviet Union being bankrupt. And then out of that, Gorbachev then realized that he needed to carry out serious economic reforms. And this is when we started to see negotiations for the first time, really, between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that's starting to freeze relations. But no one would have thought that from the mid-80s onwards, going into the late 1980s into the early 90s, would we see the collapse of this superpower that was known as the USSR. Not only was this antichrist in its system, because it was the whole ideology of the USSR was one of Marxism, was one of atheism, communism, socialism, state control, absolute totalitarian power at the hands of Stalin and other Russian leaders, and the suppression of the people of the Soviet Union that spread from Eastern Europe right through to Asia. And of course then as well, they prevented the Jewish people from actually making Aliyah to Israel. Churches were persecuted, Jewish people were persecuted, so everyone couldn't actually show any kind of cultural or have any kind of religious freedom whatsoever.
Yeah, if you consider, particularly following the fall of the Third Reich, if you consider the carving up of Germany as well, and then immediately after that, the USA and the USSR, they essentially coexist. They enter the Cold War. The USA has its focus elsewhere over the decades leading up to the fall of the USSR. We see it was beset by all manner of distractions, the Korean conflict, the war in Vietnam, not to mention its involvement in rebuilding Europe post-Nazi Germany. So you have everything going on in the USA with their other conflicts and with its other responsibilities. The USSR is getting on with things. They enter into this bitter space race as well. The space race came really before the arms race even, and it's just vying against one another. Who's going to be the best? And in every area, the Olympics, whatever it was, who was going to be the best? And whoever came out on top was seen as the powerhouse, the one that was in some way more right, as cheap as an idea as that is, more righteous in its ideology because of victory. So it was extremely bitter, but one of the things we see with the Ronald Reagan arms race that it was sparked, developing the STARS missile plan, led to agreements on the reduction of nuclear weapons on both sides. And when you consider just the sprawling nature of the USSR, what we look at today, multiple countries that were a part of that, you kind of get a sense for the scale of responsibility that the powers of the USSR had, and it's beyond control to some degree. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in Ukraine in 1986 was the worst nuclear disaster that led to the downfall, eventually, of the Soviet Union, and that broke the iron hold over its people. The fall of the Berlin Wall, as referenced earlier, was also a key moment. And at that point, we see Ronald Reagan with statesman-like conduct, the powerful, eloquent oration, hold out his hand, essentially. This is one of the first moments we see some meaningful dialogue that seems like it could bring a closer relationship between the two powers of the USA and USSR, calling for him to tear down the Berlin Wall. And of course, the wall was torn down.
That's incredible. I mean, I was I was 15. I was at school when that happened. And essentially, no, so I was 14. So what am I saying? Jumping ahead of myself. No, I was 14. And at school, they actually showed it live. So in kind of history lessons and humanitarian lessons, just put on the TV and you literally, in real time, saw those Germans from East Germany knocking down the wall, and there was nothing they could do to stop it, which was incredible. Which reminds us that CBN have got this excellent report that looks back at the fall of the Berlin Wall that happened in October 1989 and was one of the biggest triggers that triggered the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It began with a challenge from a determined American president.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
2 years later, Thursday evening, November 9th, East Germans scaled the Berlin Wall. That was the beginning of the end of the Cold War and Soviet communism. There were tears of joy, cheers, and jubilant applause as East Germans poured through the opening into West Berlin. Some had been separated from friends and relatives for more than 25 years. Others had never set foot in the West. The wall was built in August 1961 on the orders of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Over a period of nearly 3 decades, as many as 200 people had been killed attempting to escape to the West. I asked Pat Robertson to share his reflections on the 20th anniversary. He says he wasn't surprised when the wall and the communist system behind it came crashing down.
I knew that there was something about communism that was wrong. It was contrary to the human spirit. It was a failed economic system, failed social system, failed moral system. Everything about it was wrong. And I knew it would come down.
Not only did its collapse bring about an end to the Cold War, but a new opening. Christians were provided an opportunity to share the gospel with many Eastern Europeans who had never heard it. Another memorable moment came 4 months later, as Billy Graham and Pat Robertson met at the wall in Berlin.
It was a historic moment, and I was with a man who had declared that the gospel should be preached in Eastern Europe. He had gone over there and had been terribly criticized by people for doing that.
He took a lot of criticism.
A lot of criticism, but he knew that those people were hungry for God and that this was a place where the gospel would find a root, and it did.
Millions of East Europeans embraced Christianity. They're still flocking to churches like this one in Budapest, Hungary. Is it over now? Is that window of opportunity over?
I don't think it's over, but it certainly is not near as wide as it was when the wall came down. So those people were so hungry for spiritual reality. Now they have become hungry for materialism.
The world has faced many challenges since that historic weekend in Berlin. 20 years have now passed, and the Cold War has succumbed to hot wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the world's likely to face many difficult challenges in the days ahead. But this is a time for remembering and for celebrating a victory.
We forget, we move on, but these moments of triumph in our history, we need to emphasize. And it shows that a free people can triumph over totalitarianism if they're resolute. And we had a resolute president, and he won.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
And you might have guessed from that news report there that that was over 10 years old, and a lot has changed since then. Regan, I think before we talk more about the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think historically we have to say how it came about and give it and put this in its historical context.
Definitely.
And we saw that, for example, we go back to the First World War. Firstly, Russia was run by a royal family, the Tsarists, who were in power, so they had a monarchy. They backed Britain and France against the Imperial German forces during the First World War and got bogged down in the First World War. I don't know how many Russian and troops from the Eastern Europe actually died during the first part of the war, but it was colossal. We're talking millions. And then essentially we saw that Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, inspired by Karl Marx and his book Das Kapital, in which he advocated a completely different economic system, that production, the means of production would be owned by the, I think it's the proletariat, the working class, and the working class would overthrow the bourgeoisie, those ruling classes, the elites, and that the working class people would be equal under this new atheistic ideology, that people would be free, that everyone would be on the same level, and you wouldn't have the same hierarchy. I mean, if you want to know more, I think the best novel to explain this one is George Orwell's Animal Farm. Yeah. That everyone's equal apart from some. I probably haven't got that right, but it's somewhere along those lines.
Animal Farm is definitely the one.
Some animals are more equal than others. That's the exact quote.
That's right.
And so effectively what we saw then is the Bolsheviks take power. We saw that Lenin, in order to gain power from the revolution that took place in October 1917, it took almost 3 or 4 years to gain complete control of Russia and then the Soviet Union and the Ukraine. But it wasn't really until we saw the emergence of Stalin in 1924 that he then had a different perspective. Rather than spreading the communist ideology around the world like Trotsky did, who was one of the main components, who was actually Jewish, one of the main components of the revolution, together with Lenin. He wanted to he termed the whole ideological meaning of Stalinism. And what we see there is a totalitarian, total control of the Soviet Union. And we saw that the Soviet Union was also formed in 1922. And literally, he would attack anyone within the opposition, in, for example, his own government, purge people in the military that thought were disloyal. And so we had really saw the emergence of this totalitarian regime, which is absolutely horrific.
You can easily look back and see the build up to this. I mean, it was something was going to break, something was going to happen with the system. The Tsars were routinely out of touch with the common populace. That wasn't always their fault. On some occasions, there are some stories of those in the family who wanted to go out and see the common populace, to travel through some of the towns and check on those who were their subjects, so to speak. And the land was regularly impoverished. It was regularly lacking in basic necessities. And
you have to look at the famines that occurred in the Ukraine, which are absolutely horrific, where millions of people starved to death through Stalin's economic reforms.
But there were stories. There were stories in the days of the Tsars wherein they would have family traveling through particular towns, and well-dressed, healthy-looking actors would be put on the streets so that they would think, oh, all is well. Then building up to 1917, you have some very poor influences enter the Tsar's family. In popular culture, there's a lot of speculation and discussion regarding the influence of the Orthodox monk Rasputin, and you just get this picture that things are not well. The people themselves were still very submissive in their general constitutional makeup, but they were not going to be submissive to that setup any longer. So when you have charismatic leaders like Lenin who go and inspire the common populace, you can see easily how that spreads. And then you have someone who might not be as charismatic as Lenin, but who's definitely a strategist, someone like Stalin, come in, then the same mindset, the same ruling mindset of the Tsars, to a degree, kicks in with a disastrous economic policy, with a very anti-God agenda. I mean, Russia beforehand was very much Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, so heavy controls on not just the established church across the USSR, but in effect, anything outside of the established church was illegal, was banned. So evangelical churches were under extreme persecution. That's what we began to see under Stalin. It has to be said, we talk a great deal about the atrocities committed by the Third Reich. Stalin got away with a lot more. There were, I believe, over
60 million people.
Insane. So we're talking about Hitler's about 6 to 10 million, depending on what you're calculating in terms of death. But with Stalin, 50 to 60 million, and nothing was done.
Absolutely.
Incredible.
And then just moving on, we had the Soviet-Nazi Pact of 1939, in which Hitler broke that in the summer of 1941. And if you want to know more, go back to a previous edition of Behind the Headlines to look at the start of Operation Barbarossa, which is now in its 80th anniversary. And then after we saw after that happened, the Soviets become allies of the Allied forces during the Second World War, together with the Americans and the British. Were able to push the Germans back, and then took all the control of East Germany, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, Croatia, Yugoslavia. All that area became under the total control of the Soviet Union. And after the end of the Second World War, it was Winston Churchill who made the famous phrase that the Iron Curtain has fallen on the Soviet Union. And that is effectively what we had in place until 89, going on to 91. And a totalitarian regime that tried to export its totalitarian ideas around the world. And this, of course, then we had the Korean War in the late 1940s, early 50s, in which Korea was divided between the North and the South with a heavy American military intervention. And then, of course, we saw the Vietnam with the American foreign policy planners thinking that what we're going to see now is a domino effect, the spread of communism right throughout the East. As the world was in two blocks. You're either in the US bloc or you're in the Soviet bloc. And that's how the world was separated. And there was a fear that the Americans feared that this would cause a domino effect, that they would lose Vietnam, and then they would lose the Cambodia and other countries, and their influence would wane. So, of course, this is why the Americans got so involved in Vietnam. But I suppose the closest we've came to military confrontation during the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. 62, which was handled brilliantly by JFK, as we found that Khrushchev was sending then armed ships and missiles and nuclear missiles to Cuba. And that's when the world came very, very close to a nuclear Armageddon. At the same time, in the 73 Yom Kippur War as well, and even during the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union and the Americans were on red nuclear alert. So we can see then that this Cold War could have become a hot war, would have been really dangerous. But let's have a look at this second CBN news item. And this is Gary Lane talking about his experiences of being a reporter for CBN when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991.
Our CBN News reporter Gary Lane interviewed Bush in 1980 when he ran for the Republican nomination for president, ultimately losing to Ronald Reagan, who then chose him to be his vice president. And Gary also saw the Bush campaign in action in 1988 when he worked on Pat Robertson's presidential campaign. So, Gary, we know that Bush oversaw the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Why was it so important that those be handled correctly?
Well, Ephraim, because you had new democracies that were coming into fruition, or they wanted to become democracies. So they had to have cash infusions. They had to learn what it was like to have a free market economy as well. And so they needed help. They needed support, not just monetary help and support, but also political help and support. And it was important because otherwise, if they had failed, you would have seen these communists rise up again and try to take control over those countries. And today it paid off because many of those countries are now part of NATO.
Absolutely. Now, he also built a major international coalition against Saddam Hussein for Operation Desert Storm. Why was that so significant?
Well, it was significant. If you remember, Saddam Hussein moved into Kuwait, and that was an oil-rich country, still is, but he controlled the oil. So in order to get him out of there, a ground assault was needed. That would be very difficult for the United States to do on its own. He formed a coalition of almost 36 countries, and it took time to move those troops in and to move all the equipment in, and finally there was a ground and air assault, and they knocked Saddam out. And that was very significant to show that tyranny would not be tolerated in the Middle East.
Successes there in foreign policy,
Sure.
but he disappointed many conservatives on some domestic policies, did he not?
Well, I think the main thing was, remember George Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then he turned around and raised taxes, making a deal with the Democrats, and that disappointed a lot of conservatives. I think many conservatives saw him as someone who would carry on Ronald Reagan's policies and that legacy, and he did not.
How do you think he'll be remembered despite that disappointment?
I think he'll be remembered mostly for his foreign policy successes. Remember, this was a man who was ambassador to China. He was also ambassador to the United Nations, CIA director, also a congressman, and then president of the United States, war hero. And he'll be remembered for those foreign policy successes, even though he was not the one, he was not the architect of the Berlin Wall coming down. It was Ronald Reagan's policies that led to that. We needed a good manager, and he'll be remembered as a good foreign policy manager.
Indeed, if any man was prepared to be president, he certainly was.
Yes, very humble man.
Indeed, indeed.
So that was Gary Lane talking about the experiences of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also the US president at the time, George W. Bush Sr. Yeah, got it right. It's not George W. Bush, but George Bush Sr. There you go. You can get them confused. And of course, we saw George W. Bush become elected in 2000.
That's right.
Yeah, so I was there in Washington when all that happened, and yeah, that was an interesting time to be in America's capital. But going back, I think also, you know, the fear of the Soviet Union in the 50s really reached its heights with the what's known as McCarthyism. And one of the key components of McCarthyism was Nixon. This was General MacArthur, wasn't it, who was a US senator at the time after the Second World War, was concerned of the spread of communism. I think there was a great fear in the United States regarding this one. So anyone in the States they suspected of being a communist or sympathetic to communist views would then find themselves arrested.
Red fear.
Red fear.
Yeah, and if you look at just how it played out, there were many people who they actually found themselves ostracized unfairly. They found themselves, to some degree, cut off from healthy society or being followed. There was an extreme reaction to it. And you can understand, you were mentioning the domino effect. At the time, the USA felt, okay, this is not going well. We're at this gridlock. Russia has nuclear weapons. Obviously, the USA did as well, but the idea of nuclear holocaust was very much on the scene of people's minds. It probably didn't help that Hollywood was very keen to just kind of stir this up and work this up and have different films that were being produced that portrayed victory of some sort of communistic government over the USA, or that portrayed that danger. We have to recognize in any society, however righteous, you can have propaganda that stirs up fear. Fear does sell. And so there were some very, very negative repercussions. The Vietnam conflict was a total disaster. The Korean conflict was a little better, not much better. I mean, we saved South Korea, which is, in many ways, a real blessing to the world. There are so many missionaries who are sent around the world from South Korea. It's amazing to see and know that. But you look at Cambodia as well, and then eventually
Khmer Rouge.
Yeah,
horrendous.
Just absolute devastation. Then you consider Cuba. Eventually, that's even closer. That comes even closer. And I remember just some of the tenseness, the tension between the two nations. Cuba is a small little island.
Yeah, but it was off the coast of Florida.
Exactly.
And you had Fidel Castro.
Exactly.
And you also then had the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs in 1961.
And you have weapons.
which went badly for Kennedy and the Americans. That was an attempted coup against Castro that failed. And of course, then he wanted to get as a revenge. And the following year, we see the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think it's also important to put in context, because that feels like a time so long ago, over 30 years ago. The reality was that the world was divided between these big two superpowers, and the threat of nuclear weapons, the threat of a nuclear attack was so real. But they actually termed a name for it called MAD, mutually assured destruction. That if the Soviets fire a missile at the United States, a nuclear missile, then the United States would respond with nuclear weapons, and they destroy each other, and the whole civilization would die. And it was this theory called MAD, mutually assured destruction, that prevent them from actually firing any nuclear weapons during that conflict. But we came close to it a few times. But to mark the fall of the Soviet Union and to mark its 30th anniversary, this is an interview I did earlier with, so let me get his name then, David Hathaway, who is the president of Eurovision Ministries. And this is him talking about his experience of what happened when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union.
I'm delighted to be here.
Excellent. In this program today, we are marking the 30th anniversary since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when on August the 18th, President Gorbachev handed power over to Yeltsin, which really represented the complete collapse of the Soviet Union. And considering that your ministry and you've been involved in working in Russia and the former Soviet Union for most of your life, can you share with us how significant this date is to you personally, and also to the people of the former Soviet Union?
Well, this date is more significant than you realize, because firstly, it's exactly 60 years this year since I first went into the Soviet Union. It was on my overland journey to Jerusalem. You know my history. I was the first person to travel overland by road from England to Jerusalem to attend a Pentecostal conference being held in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost in 1961. So that was really, it was that first trip that opened my eyes to what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, seeing for myself. And that really is how the ministry started. But the significance of this date 30 years ago is that I started holding in 1988 a series of East-West conferences in Germany. The idea being that we were seeing, at that time, the 70s and the 80s and so on, we were seeing a real charismatic move in this country. And what I realized was that because of the restrictions, that wasn't happening behind the Iron Curtain. Oh, yes, I could evangelize even in stadiums. I mean, it's quite a story how I could get football stadiums under communism, but what hadn't impacted the churches. And so I held the East-West conferences. The first one was 1988. It was a one-off conference in which I realized the only way we could really touch the Christians, the believers, not just the pastors behind the Iron Curtain, was to bring them into a big conference. And we had 4,000 of them in Karlsruhe in West Germany in August 1988. And to me, it cost the equivalent of more than £500,000 in today's terms. And I didn't even have a mission at that time. In fact, the name Eurovision came from that first conference because I had Pastor John Osteen, not Joel, his father, and John's wife, Dodie, and we'd put a sign up. The theme of the conference was like a vision for Europe. And I remember that Dodie looked at it. We were doing a television interview, and she just looked at the sign and looked at me, and she said something which was prophetic. And she said, David, this is your vision, Eurovision. And so that became the ministry, Eurovision. It was a vision for Europe. So it came out of that. But the thing is this, because of the enormous cost, I only anticipated the one conference in '88. But when I was on the platform announcing the end of the conference and saying, come on, folks, thank you for coming. This is a miracle. So many of you got through the Iron Curtain and so on. And then the Holy Spirit came on me and said, like, what are you doing? And I'm sort of saying, I'm closing the conference. And the Holy Spirit, tell them to come back next year. And out of the blue, I just suddenly, without telling anybody or even thinking about it, I simply announced, we'll be back next year in the August. And that was key, because 2 weeks after the one in '89, the first chinks in the Iron Curtain began to open. As you remember, East Germany and the Czechoslovakia and so on, but still it didn't impact Russia. And so we held the conferences, interesting enough, '88 and '89. Then in '90, I did something unusual. I took the conference behind the Iron Curtain into Ukraine, into Kiev. Then came back into Germany in a much bigger conference in the light, well, it was in the sports stadium in 1989. 1991 and '92. But it was in '91, in that conference, I had said, when people said in 1988, why are you having another conference? I said, because God is going to open the Iron Curtain. Now, at that time, nobody, I mean, I was working there, even the people behind the Iron Curtain could never have a vision that there's, nor in the West. I mean, we had the Cold War, we had all our military, you know, everything all building up for this Cold War. And for me to prophesy God by a miracle, and when people will open it, and when people said, how? I said, you don't break iron with a hammer, you can only break iron with fire. And I said, it's the Holy Spirit will break this Iron Curtain. So in '91, when I held the conference, we had even more people coming, but still not the Soviet Union. And although I'd brought some pastors down from Siberia, but the interesting thing was, on the opening day, it's a 4-day conference, on the opening day of the conference, I was with a group of pastors on the platform praying. You know, before it starts, you're praying, and we're on the platform praying. And God gave me a vision. And in that vision, in August 1991, I saw Russia on the edge of a precipice and falling off. So in my opening message, I referred to this. The conference went on for 4 days. And strangely enough, on the 4th day, the night before, I had a repeat of this vision of Russia on the precipice and falling over. And again, I changed my message and I spoke on that. The interesting thing is this, that within 24 hours of the finish of that conference, Gorbachev was out. It wasn't the moment that he handed over to Yeltsin, which was on the 18th. It was the moment when Gorbachev was actually removed. He got on that plane and left. And in effect, we don't know whether at that point, whether he resigned or whether he was forced out, actually. It's quite a controversy. So this date for me is very, very significant because my ministry came out of what we're talking about.
Amazing. David, I have to ask you, do you think that the collapse of the former Soviet Union, or the USSR, as it's also known as, was the result of two things? Firstly, the persecution against Christians, and secondly, preventing the Jews from the Soviet Union to make aliyah to Israel, and also then being incredibly hostile towards Israel in the Cold War by supporting your enemies such as the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Iraqis.
Well, you're right, Simon, in that those were. But the two things really, when I was, because I was there, and to be quite honest, I was being called in by BBC and ITV to do interviews because I was the only one that was actually there when it was happening. And I can remember that two things particularly. One was Russia suffered an economic collapse under Gorbachev. It suffered a collapse. The second thing was that there was a powerful spiritual revival. And even on the BBC, when I said it was a spiritual move, and they questioned, ultimately it was proved right. And they had to admit that it was a move of the Holy Spirit in the churches that really was the final thing that brought the downfall of Gorbachev. It's incredible to see that what God had shown me in that dream in 1988 was literally fulfilled. And I was actually in some of those meetings, I mean, particularly in Romania. I was in there within hours of the collapse and preaching in a big stadium. And it was incredible what God was doing. So those years through were very powerful in my life.
Absolutely. But what does it mean? What did it mean for the Christians in the former Soviet Union to see the collapse of this great empire that was a world superpower that really challenged the West? It challenged democracy, it challenged Christianity, it challenged the new established state of Israel for over 70 years. And we also know that the Soviet Union under Stalin also defeated the Nazis after the Operation Barbarossa and able to push back the Nazi advance and invasion of Russia, and then to see it collapse so quickly and so unexpectedly.
Well, nobody expected it, but there's no question that this suddenly gave the freedom to the churches. And because I was involved, this is why we saw the revival come. This is what they even recognize in Ukraine. But interestingly, when I was in Moscow in 2017, when we were actually celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, Professor Diskin, who is not a believer, but an advisor to Putin, said to me privately, he said, David, we had 70 years under communism. And when communism collapsed 30 years ago, the whole Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. And he said something remarkable. He said, David, only the preaching of the gospel saved Russia from chaos. And he not only said it to me, but in the big public meeting with all the Soviet government and the church leaders, he announced publicly that only the preaching of the gospel saved Russia from total chaos 30 years ago. Now that's a remarkable testimony, particularly because it was the Soviet leaders, probably Brezhnev, who had paraded a Christian on TV and said, I will parade the last Christian on TV before we totally destroy Christianity. So having said that, the remarkable testimony from Professor Diskin, a personal advisor to Putin, saying that without Christianity, without the gospel, Russia would have gone into chaos. That's the most remarkable testimony.
No, absolutely. And what is the legacy now for Christians in Russia, in Eastern Europe, also in Central Asia that have been freed from the shackles of Soviet communism and are able to embrace the gospel? Is there still those opportunities to preach the gospel, or we're seeing this is being hindered under President Putin?
It's hindered under Putin because what they did, they passed a law some time ago that no Christian organization can rent any public building. And it means that I can no longer hold those massive crusades, which we held with tens of thousands. Yes, I will still evangelize, but it has to be done within the confines of the church in Russia, not the rest of the Soviet Union. And they are increasingly under persecution because Putin, as you know, he's arrested Navalny, as a threat because he led the opposition. He sees churches as being influenced from the West. And therefore, that's part of the background of the persecution. But what God has done, Simon, this is tremendous. He's made those churches so strong that they stand against it. And they are growing and expanding despite the pressure. And we need something like that in this country. Oh, I could talk to you about that, because it's how God has put his power and his Holy Spirit into those new young converts, those new leaders, those new churches. They will not give in to the pressure. So yes, the pressure is there.
David, I want to thank you so much for being our guest on Behind the Headlines. It's always a pleasure to interview, and your enthusiasm is extremely infectious. So I pray that God will continue to give you strength to continue, and wish you every success with your missions coming up in Poland.
Thank you.
Well, incredible service, not only on the part of David Hathaway there, but so many believers over decades faithfully plowing away underground. I have met many people who were under the USSR who they continued faithfully meeting, they continued faithfully serving, and many came to repentance and faith. And David's right there as well, that there are so many challenges, increasing challenges in some degree. So I mean, it kind of feels like we're headed back to where we were. I mean, we have these assassinations. I mean, they seem to be clear assassinations being carried out, or assassination attempts on anyone who is a dissident, anyone who speaks against the current authorities in Russia. And it creates a very complicated situation for Christians, but indeed for the whole of the Russian populace.
No, absolutely. And also kind of reminds me when we're talking about Russia and the former Soviet Union, we see that Putin, for example, has said this was the greatest catastrophe to happen in the 20th century, was the collapse of the Soviet Union, in his words. So he's been trying to reimpose Russia's role in the world.
Ex-KGB man, I mean, that's, he was very much devoted to it. And so in many ways, we have a Cold War, again, in all but name.
True, very true. But also I think it's very important that I believe one of the main reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed was to do with Bible prophecy. The fact that the Jews of the Soviet Union were not allowed to leave the Soviet Union to make Aliyah to Israel. And then in the kind of 70s and 80s, we had the movement called the Refuseniks, who were stripped of every benefit they'd received from the state, in order to lobby and put pressure on Moscow so that they can make Aliyah. And what was the main trigger point for this was actually the Six-Day War, because we have to look at the Six-Day War of June 1967 in the context of the Cold War. So it was interesting how when Israel was recreated or reformed in May 1948, they got both the backings of the Soviet Union and of the United States, because at the time, Israel was very much kind of like took on Marxist ideas. Of course, you had the kibbutz movement. Everyone owned the same means of production. And they say the only place where communism ever worked in the world was Israel with its kibbutz system. So there was a strong feeling then that this newly emerged Israel would be part of the Soviet Union, and the Americans felt like, here's a new democratic nation emerging. We have so much support from American Jewry who are backing this project that we need to support Israel. So it's amazing how in that UN vote in the United Nations that both the Soviet Union and the United States voted for Israel. And then we see that Israel's importance became more significant in the Cold War, that even Turkey, for example, in 1952, actually said that the Muslim states should drop their opposition to Israel and make peace with Israel. So the first Muslim state that Israel entered into a relationship with was Turkey in 52, because Turkey was a member of NATO, as we saw that NATO was formed then as a defense against the Warsaw Pact. And then we saw that the Americans were backing Israel more in the Cold War because the Soviets were supplying the Iraqis, the Syrians, and the Egyptians with tanks and weapons. And then what we saw in the Six-Day War, that incredible victory where Israel tripled her size, regaining Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, capturing the Sinai and the Golan Heights. But what weaponry were they fighting against? They were essentially fighting against Soviet weaponry. So then the Americans realized that, hey, we need the Israelis. You know, they've just had an absolute stunning victory. We support them, and Israel then became a major ally against the Soviets. And then we saw then in the 73 war how the Russians rearmed Syria and Egypt for that war. But prior to that, in 1968, Israel was engaged in the war of attrition between Egypt and Israel along the Sinai Peninsula, which cost a lot of Israeli lives. And for the first time in the Cold War, the Russians were flying Egyptian MiGs. And the first time in aerial combat, the Israeli Air Force shot down every single Russian MiG with Russian pilots. And it was an incredible feat in aviation, and America took note. But it was actually the victory of the Six-Day War that awakened within the Jewish people in the Soviet Union their Jewish identity, their desire to go to Israel. Because here, this little plucky Israel, surrounded by 3 Arab armies wanting to destroy Israel, backed up by the Soviet Union, supported them. And this is when they wanted to start to make aliyah to Israel. And I think it was the Lord saying to the Soviet Union, like Pharaoh, let my people go. And the Soviets didn't. And so therefore, for the nail in the coffin was the collapse of the Soviet Union, because we needed to see the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, where it says in Jeremiah, to the people in the north, let my people go, and to the people of the south, let my people go, and I will gather my people from the four corners of the earth back into their home again. So we can see that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, allowed from 91, 92, over 1.5 million Soviet Jewry make aliyah to Israel.
Yeah, it's incredible. My wife's home church was made up predominantly of Russian-speaking Jews throughout Jerusalem. Anywhere you go in Israel, really, you hear Russian being spoken, intermingled with Hebrew as well. So there's definitely, across Israel, still a very heavy Russian influence due to that. And you can still see there are a large number of Jews scattered across the former, now USSR. Unfortunately, they still experience some of the same rank anti-Semitism that was common under the USSR itself. So we look forward to the day when maybe they'll be able to get back and go to the homeland.
No, absolutely. But also, we've got less than about a minute left of the program, but very, very quickly, the world went on nuclear alert during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, after the Israelis were taken by surprise as the Egyptians invaded the Sinai and the Syrians invaded the Golan Heights. And the Israelis were desperate for American help, and Kissinger said it's time that the only way to get the Arabs into negotiations with Israel and with us is if we give Israel a bloody nose. But it was actually President Nixon at the time who actually said we need to come to the aid of Israel. And then we saw they gave the aid, and then we saw Russian warships that were on nuclear red alert. We sent American US fleet into the Mediterranean. So it's extraordinary that these events now, as we mark them over 30 years ago since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So great doing a program with you. Great to discuss this topic. And I want to thank you for watching today's program. Sadly, it's not live. But I think what we can learn from the lessons is that when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, this was God's divine intervention and judgment, because they wouldn't let his people go. And also that this enabled the gospel to be spread throughout Europe and Russia. So I want to thank you for watching this edition of Behind the Headlines.